In the small, worn-down town of Ashford, Michael Collins had lived a life of quiet humility. He was a man of few words, known more for his tireless work ethic than his social presence. Wrinkles carved deep into his weathered face were a testament to years spent toiling under the harsh sun, his back bent by the weight of survival. Yet, despite his struggles, there was one thing that never bent: his love for his daughter, Jessica. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. Jessica had always been different from him. From an early age, she showed ambition, an insatiable hunger for a life far beyond the modest means her father could provide. As she grew older, her dreams outgrew Ashford, and soon enough they outgrew Michael. Jessica's resentment toward her father's poverty had been a slow-burning fire. It started in high school when she'd see her friends with expensive clothes, the latest gadgets, things Michael couldn't afford. She began to avoid bringing friends home, ashamed of their small, run-down house. Her embarrassment transformed into bitterness, as she blamed Michael for not giving her the life she believed she deserved. Despite his efforts, Michael could never meet her expectations. He had taken extra shifts at the factory, even picked up odd jobs on weekends. But nothing was ever enough. Jessica never saw the sacrifices he made, only the inadequacy of his results. Years passed, and Jessica left for college, determined to never return to the life she felt chained her down. Her visits home became less frequent, and when she did come, they were brief and filled with cold, polite conversation. The distance between them grew wider with each passing year, until finally, she stopped coming altogether. It was a quiet evening when Michael received her last phone call. He sat in his threadbare armchair, the one Jessica used to curl up in as a child, her small body fitting perfectly against his. Now, the phone's cold metal was the only connection between them. "Jessica," he greeted softly, his voice rough from years of disuse in anything but work orders. "Hey, Dad," she replied, her tone devoid of warmth. I think it's best if we stop this. I don't think I'll be coming back anymore." Michael felt the weight of her words before they fully sank in. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew. She sighed, an exasperated sound. "I can't keep pretending, Dad. I can't keep acting like we're the same. We're not. I've worked hard to get away from that life, from everything." His silence was thick, palpable. "I have to move on," she finished, her voice resolute. "I'm sorry." And with that, she was gone. Michael sat in the dim light of the living room, the phone still clutched in his hand. The emptiness around him seemed to echo Jessica's absence. He had known for years this day might come, but nothing could prepare him for the finality of it. With a heavy sigh, he stood and shuffled to the small, worn-out kitchen. The old clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the time slipping away. He opened the fridge, pulling out the last remnants of a meager dinner, but the food had no taste. His appetite was lost to the void Jessica had left behind. As the night fell deeper, Michael wandered to his bedroom, lying in the cold bed that once seemed too small for him. Now it felt like a vast expanse of loneliness. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, memories of a little girl in pigtails, her laughter filling their modest home, played in his mind. Jessica was gone, and for the first time, Michael wondered if he had truly lost her long before that call. Months passed after Jessica's final call, and Michael's life fell into an even quieter routine. The loneliness he felt was oppressive, but he carried on with the stoic perseverance that had defined his entire existence. The small town of Ashford moved at its usual pace, slow, almost forgotten by the world, just like Michael. Jessica, however, was far from forgotten. Every night, she occupied his thoughts, her absence a constant ache that he couldn't shake. He had spent years providing for her, but all his efforts, all his sacrifices, had crumbled under the weight of her ambition. She was somewhere out there, living the life she always dreamed of, and here he was, still surrounded by the same old walls, the same old furniture, and the same old regrets. Meanwhile, Jessica's life in the city had taken off. She had clawed her way into a world that once seemed impossible. The corporate job, the sleek apartment, and the circle of polished friends. All of it felt like the life she deserved. She told herself it was worth leaving her past behind, that the distance from her father was just a necessary sacrifice for success. Yet, there were moments, quiet ones in the dead of night, where a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. The weight of her decision to abandon Michael pressed down on her, but she shoved the thoughts away. Her father's poverty, his simple life, those were things she didn't want to be associated with. Not now. Not ever. One evening, as Jessica sat at her desk in her immaculate office, an unexpected phone call disrupted her concentration. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, and at first she almost hung up, assuming it was a telemarketer. But then, something in the tone made her pause. "Miss Collins?" the voice asked, formal and distant. "Yes," she replied, impatient. "Who is this?" "My name is Samuel Porter. I'm calling to inform you of some important family matters regarding your father." Jessica froze at the mention of her father. Her chest tightened, but she fought to keep her voice even. "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are or why you're calling about my father," she said, her tone sharp. "I'm the attorney representing your father's late uncle, Charles Collins," Samuel continued. "It's come to my attention that Mr. Michael Collins has been named as the sole heir to his estate." Jessica blinked, stunned. "Estate? What estate? My father doesn't have any wealthy family." "That's precisely what I thought," Samuel replied smoothly. "But Mr. Charles Collins, your father's estranged uncle, passed away recently. He was quite wealthy, it seems, though he lived in relative obscurity for many years. As it turns out, your father stands to inherit a rather large fortune." Jessica's mind spun. Uncle Charles? She barely remembered him. There had been stories about a black sheep in the family, someone who'd cut ties long ago. But she never cared to ask about him, and her father had never spoken much of his family's history. She felt a sudden rush of excitement. Her father? A millionaire? "How much are we talking about?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Approximately $5 million, the lawyer replied without hesitation. "Though there are additional assets that could raise the total." Jessica's heart raced. $5 million. The number echoed in her head. She had spent her entire life trying to escape the chains of poverty. And now, here was an opportunity to claim the life she truly deserved. But it wasn't hers. It was Michael's. The man she had cut out of her life, the man she had abandoned. For a moment, guilt gnawed at her. How could she reach out to him now, after everything she'd said? After turning her back on him when he needed her most? But the lure of the money was overpowering. $5 million could change everything for her. She could elevate herself even further, escape any trace of her past life for good. She convinced herself it wasn't too late. Her father loved her, didn't he? Surely, if she explained, he would share the inheritance. After all, she was his only daughter. Jessica spent the next few days concocting the perfect plan. She rehearsed her words, imagined her return to Ashford, and thought about how she could reconnect with her father. She'd apologize, tell him she had made a mistake, and ask for his forgiveness. He was a kind man, easily swayed by sentiment. He'd welcome her back, and then she'd ensure her place in his newly inherited fortune. A week later, Jessica packed her bags and drove the familiar roads back to Ashford, her heart pounding in her chest. The small town felt suffocating, its drab streets and faded buildings a stark contrast to the gleaming city she had come to know. But she pushed those thoughts aside as she pulled up to her father's house. The same old house stood before her, small and unremarkable, just as she remembered. She had expected something different, something more after hearing about the inheritance. But it seemed Michael hadn't changed a thing yet. Jessica hesitated at the front door, the weight of her decision finally sinking in. Would he even want to see her? She hadn't spoken to him in months, hadn't cared enough to check on him. And now, here she was back for the money. She swallowed her guilt and knocked. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, the door creaked open, and there he stood, her father, Michael Collins, looking older and more tired than she remembered. His eyes met hers, And in that instant, Jessica saw the pain she had caused. The hurt and abandonment were etched into his face as clearly as the wrinkles. "Dad," she said, forcing a smile. "It's me." Michael stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Jessica stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning the room. Nothing had changed. The same worn furniture, the same faded walls. It was all as it had been. She sat down, trying to gather her thoughts, but the silence was unbearable. I've been thinking a lot about you, Dad," she began, her voice uncertain. "I know I've been distant, and I'm sorry. I want to make things right between us." Michael said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Dad," Jessica pressed on, her voice soft, "I know about Uncle Charles. I know about the inheritance." His head snapped up at that, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jessica felt a pang of fear in her chest. She had hoped to ease into the topic, but now there was no going back. "I thought maybe we could talk about it?" she ventured. Michael's gaze hardened. He had always been a man of few words, but now his silence was crushing. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but resolute. "You left me, Jessica," he said quietly. "You left me when all I had was you." The weight of Michael's words hung heavy in the small living room. Jessica shifted uncomfortably on the old couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't expected him to be this direct, this blunt. In her mind, she had imagined a soft, tearful reunion where her father's love would overcome any hurt she had caused. But the reality was different, far harsher. "Dad, I didn't mean for things to go this way," Jessica said quietly, her voice faltering. "I've been trying to find my way, trying to make something of myself. You know how hard I've worked." Michael's eyes remained fixed on her, his expression unyielding. "You were ashamed of me, Jessica. You were ashamed of where you came from. You didn't want anyone to know you had a father who couldn't give you everything you wanted." Jessica swallowed hard. She wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't true, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all the memories of her coldness, her resentment toward him, flooded her mind. She had been ashamed of the poverty, the worn clothes, the small house, and more than that, she had been ashamed of her father's simplicity, of his quiet, contented life. To her, it had always felt like failure. "I was young," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I didn't understand then." Michael shook his head, his gaze softening slightly but still filled with disappointment. "You're not young anymore, Jessica. You've been gone for years. You chose your path. Now, why are you really here?" The question hit her like a slap. There was no point in lying now. Her father had always been able to see through her, even if she had never admitted it to herself. She had come for the money, and now she was face to face with the man she had abandoned, knowing he deserved an explanation. "I heard about the inheritance," she confessed, her eyes dropping to the floor. I thought maybe we could talk about it." For a long time, Michael said nothing. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and thick, as Jessica sat there, waiting for him to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet sadness, rather than anger. "You think you can come back after all this time, say a few words, and expect me to hand over money? Is that really why you're here?" Jessica's stomach churned with guilt. She had known it would be difficult, but hearing the truth spoken so plainly by her father made it unbearable. She wanted to explain, to justify her actions, but the words felt hollow even before they left her mouth. "I'm not asking for all of it, Dad," she said, trying to sound reasonable. Just enough to get by. You have more than you could ever need now, and I—" "Enough," Michael interrupted, his voice suddenly firm. He rose slowly from his chair, his back still hunched from years of hard labor, but his presence in the room felt powerful. "Jessica, you don't understand. You've never understood." Jessica looked up at him, confusion etched across her face. I don't understand? What don't I understand, Dad?" "You think money will fix everything," Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of years of struggle. You think it'll erase the mistakes you've made, the choices that led you here. But it won't. It never will. Jessica's face flushed with frustration. So what then? You expect me to live like this forever? You expect me to sit by while you hoard money that could change both of our lives? Michael shook his head slowly, his expression filled with a quiet sorrow. That's the difference between us, Jessica. I've never cared about the money. I've spent my whole life working hard for what little I had, and I never needed anything more. But you let your ambition turn you into someone I don't even recognize. Her frustration grew, bubbling just beneath the surface. Maybe I needed more than you did. Maybe I wanted a better life. And look where that's gotten you, Michael said softly, his eyes locking with hers. You've lost everything that really mattered. Jessica fell silent. The truth of his words stung more than she wanted to admit. In her quest for success, for wealth, she had indeed lost the things that mattered most. Her connection to her father, her roots, and her sense of family. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. There had to be a way to salvage this. Dad? She started, her tone shifting, trying to soften the blow. I'm not asking for much. I just need a fresh start. I've been working so hard, but I've hit a rough patch. This money, it could help me get back on my feet. Michael's gaze never wavered. And what will happen when the money runs out? Will you come back again? Ask for more? Jessica felt her face flush. It won't come to that. How can you be sure? He pressed, his voice stern but not unkind. You've always wanted more, Jessica. You've always wanted what I couldn't give you. But you never stopped to see what you had right in front of you. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, unbidden and unwanted. She hadn't expected this conversation to dig so deep into her, to force her to confront the parts of herself she had tried so hard to ignore. But her father's words cut through her defenses, and she felt exposed, vulnerable. I don't know how else to fix things, she whispered, her voice breaking. I made mistakes. I know that. But I'm here now. Doesn't that count for something? Michael's face softened slightly, but the sadness in his eyes remained. It's not about the money, Jessica. It never was. It's about the choices we make. You chose to walk away. You chose to leave me behind. Jessica's tears began to fall freely now, her carefully crafted plans unraveling before her. She had thought she could come back, apologize, and everything would fall into place. But standing in front of her father, she realized just how much she had lost, how far she had drifted from the person she once was. I'm sorry, Dad, she choked out, barely able to meet his gaze. I'm so sorry. Michael stood silently for a moment, his heart aching at the sight of his daughter's pain. He wanted to forgive her, to hold her and tell her everything would be all right. But something inside him had hardened over the years, something that couldn't be undone by a few tears. You're my daughter, Jessica, he said quietly. I'll always love you. But love doesn't mean I can ignore what you've done. You have to live with your choices, just like I've had to live with mine. Jessica looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. So what now? You don't want me in your life anymore? You don't want me to come back? Michael's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. That's up to you, Jessica. But if you're only here for the money, then no, I don't want you coming back. Not like this. Jessica sat in stunned silence, her father's words echoing in her mind. Asterisk. If you're only here for the money, then no, I don't want you coming back. Not like this. Asterisk. She hadn't anticipated this level of rejection, especially not from the man she believed would always be there for her. The reality of the situation, of what she had truly come back for, settled like a stone in her chest. Michael stood before her, his posture a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. He had spent too many years hoping his daughter would return out of love, not greed. And now, faced with her desperation, he couldn't allow himself to bend to her will. Not when the fracture between them ran so deep. Jessica wiped her tears hastily, her mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had imagined her father welcoming her with open arms, offering her a share of the inheritance without hesitation. But here she was, feeling more distant from him than ever. "Dad," she started again, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not just here for the money. I came because I miss you." Michael sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "You say that, Jessica, but the first thing you mentioned was the inheritance. You didn't come back until you heard about it." His words stung. She wanted to deny it, but what could she say? He was right. The guilt gnawed at her, but her mind kept drifting back to the opportunity the money represented. $5 million. The number had been playing on repeat in her head ever since that phone call from the lawyer. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice wavering. "I know I was wrong to leave the way I did, but I've worked so hard to get where I am, and it hasn't been easy. I thought maybe this could be a new start for both of us." Michael's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "A new start for you, maybe, but you didn't come back because you wanted to rebuild our relationship. You came because you wanted something from me." Jessica lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. The truth of his words weighed heavily on her, and for a moment, she felt the full shame of her actions. She had let her ambition consume her, had allowed it to tear her away from the one person who had loved her unconditionally. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, the fight draining from her. Michael sat down across from her, his face lined with sadness. "It's not about what you say, Jessica. It's about what you do. And I need to know if you're here because you truly want to fix things between us, or if you're just here because of the money." Jessica swallowed hard, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. She knew this was a moment of reckoning. Her father was giving her a choice, one that could either mend the broken bond between them or sever it forever. She hesitated, her thoughts a jumbled mess. She wanted to say the right thing, but what was the right thing? Part of her still longed for the financial security the inheritance could provide, but another part, the part she had buried for so long, yearned for her father's love and forgiveness. "I'm here for you, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm here because I want to make things right between us." Michael studied her carefully, his tired eyes searching for any trace of sincerity. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that his daughter had finally come to her senses. But years of disappointment had made him wary, and he wasn't ready to be hurt again. "You say that now," he said quietly. "But actions speak louder than words, Jessica. You walked away from me once. How do I know you won't do it again?" Jessica looked up, meeting his gaze with desperate determination. "I won't, Dad. I won't leave again. Promise." Michael remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But something inside him resisted, a wall built over years of heartache and loneliness. "I don't know if I can trust that," he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. The words hit Jessica harder than she expected. She had never imagined that her father's faith in her could be so fractured, that he could doubt her so deeply. She had always taken his love for granted, assuming it would always be there, no matter how far she strayed. But now, faced with the consequences of her choices, she realized just how fragile that love had become. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "give me a chance to prove it. I'm not that person anymore. I don't want to be." Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with a sorrow that came from years of disappointment. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and heavy. "You've already shown me who you are, Jessica," he said quietly. "You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." Jessica's heart sank as he spoke, her last hope slipping away. She had come here expecting forgiveness, expecting to be welcomed back with open arms. But instead, she had found the door closing in her face. "I think you should leave," Michael added softly, his voice laced with regret. "I need time to think. And so do you." The finality of his words settled over Jessica like a suffocating blanket. She had failed. The carefully constructed plan she had envisioned crumbled before her, leaving her with nothing but the stark reality of her father's disappointment. Without another word, Jessica stood and gathered her things, her hands trembling. She wanted to say something more, to plead with him, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had pushed too far, and now she had to live with the consequences. As she reached the door, she turned to look at her father one last time. He stood by the window, his back to her, his figure silhouetted by the fading light of the afternoon. In that moment, Jessica realized just how much she had lost. Not the money, but the connection she once had with the man who had raised her. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, but her words were swallowed by the quiet room. She didn't wait for a response, knowing there wouldn't be one. With a heavy heart, she stepped outside and closed the door behind her, the sound of it echoing in the empty street. As Jessica walked away from the house, the weight of her choices pressed down on her with each step. She had come seeking money, but what she had truly lost was far more valuable. Back inside the house, Michael stood by the window, watching his daughter leave. His heart ached with the weight of their fractured relationship, but he knew that this time, things couldn't be easily mended. He had warned her for years that her ambition would cost her, but he never imagined it would cost them both so much. Jessica's drive back to the city felt like a blur. The quiet, empty streets of Ashford faded into the background as she sped down the highway, her mind swirling with regret and confusion. The conversation with her father played on an endless loop in her head, his voice, heavy with disappointment, cutting deeper than she'd ever imagined. She had come to ask for money, for a piece of the inheritance that could have made her life easier. But now, she realized that what she had truly wanted was something far more elusive: her father's approval, his love. She had lost him, not just today, but over the years, as her ambition had driven her further away from the man who had sacrificed everything for her. Jessica gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. She hated feeling this way, weak, vulnerable, like a child who had disappointed her parent. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had always prided herself on being independent, on building a life free from the constraints of her past. But now all of that success felt hollow. Arriving back in the city, Jessica pulled into the underground garage of her high-rise apartment building. The sleek, modern building had once filled her with pride, a symbol of the life she had worked so hard to achieve. But tonight, it felt cold and distant, a stark reminder of the choices she had made. The elevator ride to her apartment was suffocating in its silence. As the doors slid open, Jessica stepped into the pristine space she called home. The minimalist decor, the clean lines, the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the sparkling city skyline. It all seemed so perfect, so polished. But none of it felt real anymore. She dropped her keys on the counter and sank onto the couch, her mind reeling. Her father's rejection had cut her deeper than she'd expected. For so long, she had convinced herself that she didn't need anyone, that success was measured in dollars and achievements. But now, sitting alone in her expensive apartment, she realized just how empty her life had become. What now? She thought, staring blankly at the wall. She had burned the bridge with her father, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be rebuilt. The money she had hoped to claim was gone, along with the fragile hope of reconnecting with the man who had raised her. And for the first time in years, Jessica felt utterly lost. Meanwhile, back in Ashford, Michael sat in his small, worn-down living room, the echoes of Jessica's departure still lingering in the air. He had watched her walk away, the sight of her retreating figure pulling at his heart. He wanted to go after her, to tell her that everything would be okay, that they could work through this. But he couldn't. He had tried so hard to be the father she needed, but in the end, it wasn't enough. Jessica had always wanted more than he could give, more than their humble life could offer. And now, after all these years, he was left wondering if he had failed her. Michael glanced at the stack of papers on the table, the documents outlining the inheritance from his estranged uncle. $5 million. It was a staggering sum, one that could change everything. But as he looked around his modest home, filled with memories of Jessica's childhood, he realized that money couldn't fix what was broken. It wasn't about the inheritance or the wealth it promised. It was about the choices they had both made, the distance that had grown between them, fueled by Jessica's ambition and Michael's quiet acceptance of his life. He had always thought that love and hard work would be enough, But now he wasn't so sure. The thought of Jessica coming back, not out of love, but out of a desire for the money, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't the reunion he had imagined. She had come for the wrong reasons, and it tore at him to see how far she had drifted from the values he had tried to instill in her. With a heavy sigh, Michael rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The night was still, and the stars twinkled faintly above, a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond Ashford. He wondered where Jessica was now, what she was thinking. Was she regretting her visit? Or was she already moving on, her mind focused on the next opportunity, the next way to climb higher? As he stood there, lost in thought, a knock on the door startled him. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at this hour. He opened the door cautiously, and to his surprise, there stood Samuel Porter, the attorney who had handled the inheritance. "Mr. Collins," Samuel greeted him with a nod, his face solemn. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to speak with you about a few matters regarding your uncle's estate." Michael gestured for him to come inside, still feeling uneasy about the sudden visit. Samuel entered the house, his sharp eyes taking in the humble surroundings. He placed a folder on the table and sat down, his expression businesslike. "Mr. Collins," Samuel began, "I wanted to inform you that there are a few complexities regarding your uncle's estate that I think you should be aware of." Michael frowned, sitting across from him. "What kind of complexities?" Samuel cleared his throat and opened the folder. "While the inheritance is substantial, there are certain legal obligations that come with it. Your uncle, Charles Collins, left behind a number of unpaid debts, as well as some outstanding issues with the property he owned. It's not as straightforward as just receiving the money. You'll need to settle these matters before the inheritance can be fully transferred." Michael's heart sank. Of course, there had to be complications. Nothing in life was ever simple, especially not when it came to money. But he wasn't interested in the inheritance for himself. His mind immediately went to Jessica. She had returned because of the money, and now it seemed even that was out of reach. "How much are we talking about?" Michael asked, his voice weary. "It's difficult to say at this point," Samuel replied, flipping through the papers. "But based on preliminary estimates, it could be several $100,000 in legal fees and debt settlements. The process could take months, maybe even longer." Michael rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. This wasn't what he had wanted. All he had ever wanted was to live a quiet life, to provide for his daughter and see her happy. But now it seemed like the inheritance was more trouble than it was worth. "Is there any way to avoid this?" he asked, his voice strained. Samuel shook his head. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Collins. These matters have to be dealt with. If you choose to reject the inheritance, it will pass to the next of kin, which—" "Jessica," Michael muttered, his heart heavy with the realization. "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "Your daughter would be the next in line." Michael stared at the papers on the table, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to protect Jessica from the harsh realities of life. And now, here she was, caught in the middle of a situation he couldn't control. "I need time to think," Michael said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Samuel nodded, gathering his things. "Of course, take all the time you need. But just know that these matters can't be delayed indefinitely. The longer they go unresolved, the more complicated they'll become." Michael stood and walked Samuel to the door, his mind spinning with the implications of everything he had just learned. The inheritance wasn't the blessing it had appeared to be. It was a tangled web of debts, obligations, and legal battles. And now Jessica was caught in the middle of it. As Samuel left, Michael stood in the doorway, staring out into the quiet night. He had always believed that money wasn't the answer to life's problems. And now, more than ever, he realized just how true that was. The inheritance wouldn't fix the rift between him and Jessica. It wouldn't erase the years of hurt and distance. If anything, it might make things worse. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft light over the quiet streets of Ashford. Inside his modest home, Michael sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers scattered before him. The attorney's visit the night before had left him unsettled. The inheritance, which had initially seemed like a strange and unexpected blessing, now felt more like a burden. It came with complications, debts, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility, things he had never wanted in the first place. He sipped his coffee, his mind wandering back to Jessica. Her face, her words, her tears. All of it replayed in his head, an endless loop of guilt and regret. He had been hard on her, he knew that, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her return had been driven more by the allure of money than a desire to mend their broken relationship. Still, she was his daughter. He had spent years raising her, sacrificing his own happiness to ensure she had everything he could possibly provide. And now, after all this time, he found himself standing at a crossroads. Could he forgive her? Could he trust her again? Or had the distance between them grown too wide to ever be bridged? The doorbell rang, pulling Michael from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. As he stood and made his way to the door, his heart tightened. Part of him hoped it was Jessica coming back to talk, to make things right. But as he opened the door, he was greeted by someone else entirely. Samuel Porter, the attorney, once again standing on his doorstep. "Mr. Collins," Samuel greeted, his tone more formal than before. "I apologize for showing up unannounced, but there's been a new development regarding your uncle's estate." Michael frowned, stepping aside to let the man in. "What kind of development?" Samuel walked into the small living room and placed his briefcase on the table. He opened it quickly and retrieved a thin folder. "After further review of your uncle's assets, it seems there are additional properties, ones that weren't listed in the initial documentation. However, they come with further complications. Some are tied up in legal disputes that have been ongoing for years." Michael felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him again. More complications, more legal battles. It was becoming clear that the inheritance was anything but straightforward. "What does this mean for me?" Michael asked, already knowing the answer. Samuel adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "It means that unless these disputes are resolved, the full transfer of the estate will be delayed indefinitely. It also means more legal fees and potentially more time spent dealing with the courts." Michael let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his forehead. This was exactly what he didn't want. He had never cared about the money, but now it seemed like he was being pulled deeper and deeper into a mess that he hadn't asked for. "Can I just reject the whole thing?" he asked, his voice tired. "Let it pass to my daughter?" Samuel paused, clearly taken aback by the question. "Mr. Collins, I would advise against that. While your daughter would become the next beneficiary, she would inherit not only the assets but also the debts and legal obligations. It could put her in a very difficult financial situation." Michael frowned. The last thing he wanted was to burden Jessica with a legal nightmare, but he couldn't handle this on his own. The weight of it all was too much. Samuel continued, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to make any decisions right now, Mr. Collins, but I would strongly recommend speaking with your daughter before considering such a drastic step. There may be other options, ways to resolve these issues without rejecting the inheritance altogether." Michael nodded, though his mind was still racing. The thought of talking to Jessica again felt like opening an old wound. Their last conversation had been painful enough, and he wasn't sure if he could face her now, especially after everything that had been said. "Thank you, Samuel," Michael said finally, his voice weary. "I'll think about it." The attorney packed up his things and left, leaving Michael alone once more with his thoughts. He stared at the papers on the table, the words blurring together as the enormity of the situation settled over him. In the city, Jessica was struggling with her own turmoil. It had been days since she left Ashford, and the conversation with her father still haunted her. She had tried to push it out of her mind, to throw herself back into her work, but nothing seemed to distract her from the gnawing guilt that lingered in the back of her mind. She had been selfish, she knew that. She had come back for the money, not for him. And now, after seeing the hurt in her father's eyes, she wasn't sure if she could ever make things right. Sitting in her pristine apartment, surrounded by all the things she had once believed would bring her happiness, Jessica felt more empty than ever. The success she had worked so hard to achieve now felt meaningless. What good was a fancy job, a sleek apartment, and a glamorous lifestyle if she had no one to share it with? Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was an email from Samuel Porter, the attorney handling her father's inheritance. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. The email was brief, but the message was clear. The inheritance was far more complicated than it seemed. There were debts, legal disputes, and an overwhelming number of financial obligations tied to the estate. The full transfer of the money could take months, if not years, to resolve. Jessica stared at the screen, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had come back to Ashford hoping for a quick fix, an easy way to get what she thought she deserved. But now, she realized that the inheritance was nothing but a tangled web of problems. Her father was right. The money wasn't the answer. For the first time in years, Jessica felt lost. All the things she had worked so hard for seemed to slip through her fingers, and she was left wondering what she had sacrificed it all for. Her ambition had driven her away from the one person who had always been there for her. And now, she wasn't sure if there was a way back. Taking a deep breath, Jessica picked up her phone and dialed her father's number. Her heart raced as the line rang, her fingers trembling as she waited for him to answer. "Hello." Michael's voice came through the speaker, rough and quiet. "Dad," Jessica said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching out between them like an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had gone wrong. I got an email from the lawyer," Jessica continued, her voice faltering. "I didn't realize how complicated things were. I didn't know." Michael sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. "It's not just the money, Jessica. It's never been about the money." "I know," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I shouldn't have come back like that. I shouldn't have asked for anything." Another pause. "You're my daughter," Michael said finally, his voice soft but steady. "That's never going to change. But we've got a lot to work through, Jessica. And it's not going to be easy." Jessica nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I want to fix things, Dad. I don't care about the money anymore. I just want us to be okay." Michael's voice softened. "I want that too." The conversation lingered in the air, both of them unsure of what came next. But for the first time in years, there was a sliver of hope between them, a small crack in the wall that had kept them apart. "We'll figure it out," Michael said quietly. "One step at a time." Jessica wiped her tears, her heart full of relief. "Okay, Dad. One step at a time." The days after Jessica's phone call were quiet but tense. She had reached out, breaking the silence between them, but the path to mending their relationship remained unclear. The distance between them was still there, built from years of resentment and misunderstanding. Yet, for the first time, there was hope. Back in Ashford, Michael spent his days in thought, his mind often drifting to the conversation they had over the phone. He wanted to believe that Jessica was sincere, that she truly wanted to make things right, but part of him remained cautious. He had seen the fire of ambition in her eyes for years, and it had always driven her away from him. What if this was just another attempt to get closer to the inheritance? But then there was the other part, the part that remembered the little girl who used to sit by his side, who used to laugh and play in the fields, who loved him simply because he was her father. That part of him wanted to believe she could still be that person. A week passed before Jessica worked up the courage to return to Ashford. The city felt smaller this time, less stifling. Though it still carried the weight of memories she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But if she was going to fix things with her father, she had to come back. She had to show him that she meant what she said. When she pulled up to the familiar, worn-down house, Jessica's heart raced. She sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door. This was the place she had spent so many years trying to escape, and now here she was again, not for money, not for success, but for something much more important: family. Taking a deep breath, Jessica stepped out of the car and made her way to the door. She knocked softly, her nerves on edge. The wait seemed endless, But finally, the door creaked open, and there stood Michael, looking older and wearier than she remembered. "Dad," Jessica greeted, her voice soft, uncertain. Michael nodded but didn't say anything at first. He simply stepped aside, allowing her to come in. The air between them was heavy, but there was no anger this time, no tension like before. Just quiet, tentative steps toward something that could be rebuilt. They sat down in the small living room, the same room where they had exchanged harsh words not long ago. Jessica glanced around, noticing how little had changed. The same old furniture, the same faded wallpaper. Everything was just as she had left it. But now it didn't seem so small, so suffocating. Felt like home. "I'm glad you came back," Michael said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, but there was warmth in it. A warmth Jessica hadn't heard in a long time. "I had to," Jessica replied, her eyes meeting his. "I meant what I said, Dad. I don't care about the money anymore. I just want us to fix things." Michael nodded, though his expression was guarded. "It's not going to be easy, Jess. We've got a lot to work through." Jessica swallowed, her heart heavy. "I know, but I'm willing to try if you are." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of the past lingering between them. It wasn't just the fight about the inheritance. It was years of distance, of ambition that had driven them apart. But now, there was a sliver of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been lost. "I've been thinking a lot," Michael said after a while, "about what you said before, about wanting a better life. I get it. I really do. I never knew how to give you that. I tried, but it was never enough." Jessica's throat tightened. "Dad, it wasn't your fault. I was so focused on what I didn't have. I never saw how much you were giving me." Michael shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. "Maybe, but I should have done more. I should have been there for you in a way that made you feel like you didn't have to leave." Jessica leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You were always there for me. I was just too blind to see it." They sat in the quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. The years had been hard on both of them. Michael with his quiet sacrifices and Jessica with her relentless pursuit of a life she thought she needed. But now, sitting together in the small, familiar living room, it was clear that what they truly needed was each other. "I don't know how to fix this," Michael admitted, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "But I want to try." Jessica nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Me too." For the first time in years, there was a sense of understanding between them. The wounds were still there, but they weren't as raw, as painful. There was space for healing now, if they were both willing to put in the effort. They spent the afternoon talking, really talking. Not about the money, not about the past, but about the things that mattered. Jessica told him about her life in the city, the pressure she had felt to succeed, and the emptiness that came with it. Michael shared his quiet fears, the loneliness that had settled in after she left, and the pride he had always felt for her, even when they were apart. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still unspoken hurt that lingered beneath the surface. But it was a start, a small, fragile step toward rebuilding what had been broken. As the afternoon faded into evening, Michael stood up and made his way to the small kitchen. He returned with 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to Jessica as they sat together in the fading light. "There's something I need to tell you," Michael said after a long sip of his coffee. Jessica looked at him, curious but calm. "What is it?" "The inheritance," he began slowly, his voice thoughtful. "It's not what it seems. There are debts, legal disputes. It's a mess. I was thinking about rejecting it, letting it pass to you, but I don't want to put that burden on you." Jessica blinked, surprised. "I didn't know." "I didn't either, not at first," Michael admitted. "But the lawyer told me everything. It's more trouble than it's worth." For the first time, Jessica felt a wave of relief. The money no longer held the same allure it once did. It wasn't the solution to her problems. It wasn't what she needed. "I don't care about the money," she said softly, meeting her father's gaze. "We don't need it." Michael looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, we don't. They sat in the fading light, the warmth of the coffee and the quiet peace between them enough to fill the room. The inheritance, the wealth, the ambition that had driven them apart. It all seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to what they had nearly lost. "Let's figure this out together," Jessica said after a while, her voice steady. "Whatever happens with the inheritance, we'll deal with it. But I don't want it to come between us again." Michael nodded, his eyes soft with a mixture of pride and relief. "We will." For the first time in years, Jessica felt a sense of calm. She had come back to Ashford looking for money, but what she had found was far more valuable. Her father's love, his forgiveness, and the chance to start again. Weeks passed, and a slow, steady rhythm began to settle between Jessica and Michael. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, still silences that felt heavy with unspoken words. But for the first time in years, they were working toward something real. The weight of the inheritance, once a looming shadow over their relationship, no longer held any sway over them. Michael's decision had been clear from the start. The inheritance wasn't worth the trouble. He had no desire to get involved in lengthy legal battles or deal with the debts his uncle had left behind. What mattered to him now was something far more precious, the time he still had with his daughter, and the chance to repair the damage that had been done. Jessica, too, had come to see things differently. Her life in the city, the success she had once coveted, felt like a distant dream now. In its place was something simpler, quieter, but far more fulfilling. She had rediscovered a part of herself she hadn't even realized was missing, the part that craved connection, family, and the sense of belonging she had once taken for granted. On a crisp autumn morning, Jessica arrived at her father's house with a sense of purpose. She had made a decision that just a few months ago would have seemed impossible. As she stepped inside the familiar living room, she found Michael sitting by the window, gazing out at the street. He turned when he heard her enter, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Hey, Dad," Jessica greeted, sitting down beside him. Michael nodded. "Morning, Jess. You look like you've got something on your mind." Jessica took a deep breath, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the coffee table. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about the inheritance and about us." Michael listened quietly, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't want the money," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I don't want any of it. I don't care about the inheritance or the debts or any of it. I just want us to move on. I don't want anything to come between us again." Michael's face softened, a mixture of pride and relief washing over him. "I'm glad to hear that, Jess, but you don't have to make that decision for my sake." "I'm not," she said quickly. "I'm making it for me. I've spent so much of my life chasing things I thought I needed. Money, success, recognition. But none of that matters if I don't have you. If we don't have each other." Michael's eyes glistened with emotion as he reached out and took her hand. "I couldn't be more proud of you, Jess." They sat there in the quiet for a moment, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. It had taken years of distance, of hurt, of ambition that had driven them apart. But now they were finally finding their way back to each other. "You know," Michael said after a while, his voice soft, "I always worried that I wasn't enough for you, that I couldn't give you the life you deserved." Jessica shook her head, her voice filled with regret. "You gave me everything, Dad. I just didn't see it. I was so caught up in what I thought I needed that I didn't appreciate what I already had." Michael smiled, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Well, I'm glad you're here now. That's all that matters." They sat in the warmth of the morning sun, the silence between them no longer filled with tension, but with peace. The inheritance, once a symbol of wealth and opportunity, had faded into the background, leaving behind something far more valuable. Their relationship, the love that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. 2 weeks later, Samuel Porter returned to Ashford for one final meeting. This time, the mood was different. The legal battles over the inheritance had been settled, and Michael had made his decision. He would decline the estate, allowing it to be absorbed by the state to pay off the debts and unresolved issues. He wanted nothing more to do with it. As Samuel handed over the final paperwork for Michael to sign, he glanced at Jessica, who stood beside her father, a quiet strength in her eyes. "I have to admit," Samuel said, his voice respectful, "most people wouldn't walk away from a sum of money like this. You're making quite the statement." Michael chuckled softly as he signed the papers. "It's not about the money. It never was." Samuel nodded, clearly understanding more now than he had at the beginning. "Well, if you're ever in need of assistance in the future, don't hesitate to reach out." Jessica smiled politely as Samuel left, leaving them alone in the small living room once again. She turned to her father, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. "Is it strange to say that I feel relieved?" she asked, a soft laugh escaping her. Michael grinned, his eyes warm. "Not strange at all." They stood in the quiet, both of them realizing just how far they had come. The money, the inheritance, had been a test of their relationship, of their values, of what truly mattered. And in the end, it had brought them closer than they ever could have imagined. Months passed, and the winter chill set in over Ashford. Jessica had decided to spend more time with her father, splitting her days between the city and the small town she had once left behind. They were rebuilding their relationship, slowly but surely, one day at a time. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Michael glanced at Jessica, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. "You know," he said softly, "you're the best thing I've ever done, Jess. The one thing I'll never regret." Jessica smiled, her heart full. "I feel the same way, Dad." They sat in the warmth of the fire, the crackling flames casting a soft glow over the room. Outside, the snow began to fall, but inside, there was only peace. A peace that came from knowing that they had found their way back to each other, that they had finally discovered the true inheritance that had always been theirs. It wasn't money or success or ambition. It was love, family, forgiveness, and that was more than enough.